Despite the vigorous public contest over ratification, the nation seemed to rally around the government once George Washington was elected president. Elections were successfully held every 2 years after that, and the United States government was able to overcome all the problems that ratification had left over. For instance, the holding out of Rhode Island and North Carolina, and of course the demand for the Bill of Rights. If we consider for a moment the precariousness of the new government, this overwhelming evidence of consent from the governed has to be counted as a serious factor in determining the success of the Constitution and the government of the United States. It also sets the stage for the discussion of how the Constitution was given shape and meaning. In determining the Constitution's original meaning, this early period stands out. These men, many of whom had shaped the document in Philadelphia and had taken part of the debate during ratification, filled out much of the document's substance. The first Congress certainly did a lion's share of the work, but so too did the other Congresses of the 1790s. Nonetheless, it is important to think about these things in terms of contest, as much of the substance of the document was developed during specific contests over what the Constitution meant. And I'll say here, I talked in the last lecture about legal analysis and historical analysis. From the legal perspective, the interpretation given to the Constitution of the First Congress holds an authoritative weight because they were so close to the creation. This is something that will be repeatedly mentioned as a principle of construction during the antebellum era and even today. The fact that George Washington signs things into law, that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton helped draft legislation, means a lot in terms of establishing the substantive content of the Constitution. Now, we've already disposed of the Bill of Rights, one of the most important actions that this new Congress took, although recall, not a pleasant action by any stretch, and not one that James Madison looked forward to. Let us now turn to some of the other constitutional achievements and the controversies that attended it. Members of the first Congress were aware that they were setting precedent, which, if the nation survived, would be closely followed and examined for many years. They began, as did the Constitutional Convention, or for that matter, any new body of people meeting for the first time, by establishing rules for their proceedings. It adopted rules of debate and rules for procedure. I might mention, I'm not going to talk too much about the rules that they established, but a couple of them are actually very important. First of all, the House of Representatives votes to make all of their proceedings public and published. So they are, and we have a firm record of everything done in Congress. The Senate, on the other hand, keeps its proceedings secret and will keep it secret for some time. They don't open the doors to their chambers for some time. They only give them the barest of records. All debates are privileged. They also abandon much of the civility that we saw during the Constitutional Convention, although they adopt many of the same rules. For instance, the ability to call people to order. But as we'll see, rancorous debate is absolutely the norm. One of the most important acts of the first Congress is passage of the Judiciary Act of 1789, and I mentioned it first because it's a signal achievement, giving shape and power to a judiciary not well described in the text of the Constitution itself. But we'll deal with this in our next lecture on the early Supreme Court. A similarly important act was the first Congress's organization of the executive branch, which it took up on May 19, 1789, when Representative Elias Boudinot of New Jersey proposed a Department of Finance. There was no provision in the Constitution for specific departments or for major secretaries. Nonetheless, it was alluded to in Article 2, Section 2. And here you see the text of that right here. Likewise, the process for nominations and appointment for all officers was also provided for. So from these raw materials, the House of Representatives took up the question of executive departments. After several interventions, James Madison took up the suggestion that 3 major Departments of States be organized: Foreign Affairs, War, and the Treasury, each headed by a secretary, quote, who shall be appointed by the President by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, and to be removable by the President, end quote. William L. Smith, who had been trained in the English Inns of Court, objected to the by and with the advice and consent of the Senate clause as superfluous, and as such it was discarded. But more enigmatic was the last part of Madison's proposal, that department heads be removable by the President. The Constitution said nothing about the removal of officers. Who thus had the power to remove them? This problem is worth thinking about in terms of constitutional authority and power. There was no question that the Constitution vested the power to appoint officers jointly in the presidency and the Senate. But where did it vest the power of removal? As it was silent on this matter, the House was now in a position where it had to declare, by authority of Congress, that the power was either inherent in the executive or it was another joint power held between the Senate and the executive. Oh, and by the way, if it's a joint power, why can't the House claim it partially for itself as well? William L. Smith suggested that an appropriate reading of the Constitution meant that impeachment was the only viable means of proceeding. This view depended upon one reading of the Constitution as a closed system, that the positive command of Article 2, Section 4, that the President and other officers shall be removed from office by impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors, should be interpreted as the only means by which officers might be removed. It would essentially have extended judicial tenure to all officers of the executive branch. Smith's argument did not carry. He immediately proposed another interpretation. He argued that the Senate's consent should be required in removal. He quoted at this point Federalist 77, in which Alexander Hamilton had written that, quote, the consent of the Senate would be necessary to displace as well as to appoint, end quote. At this point, Egbert Benson sent Smith a note from across the room telling him that he had spoken with Publius, and upon mature reflection, Publius had changed his mind. And of course, he's debating James Madison right here. He knows Madison is one author and Publius. And Alexander Hamilton is a candidate for the Secretary of the Treasury. And of course, he is opposing it as well. So he did not press this point any further. Egbert Benson of New York proposed an amendment to Madison's bill, stating that, quote, the chief clerk of the department would take up its records whenever the president removed the secretary, end quote. This is a really nice turn of language. It has the benefit of confirming removal as an executive power without asserting that the removal was derived from an act of Congress. In short, it acknowledges that removal is an inherent power of the executive. Notice here, the chief clerk of the department would take charge of its records whenever the president removed the secretary. It's not saying the president has the power to remove the secretary, but merely saying when that happens, we rule that the chief clerk will take the records over. This is something that William Smith found quite distasteful, by the way. Construing the Constitution, he suggested, should be left up to the judiciary. In fact, he said, legislative construction of the Constitution potentially infringed on the power of the judiciary. James Madison answered William Smith. While Madison granted that the judiciary's purview was to construe the Constitution and the laws, this was a prerogative, said Madison, of all three departments. Moreover, none of these independent departments has more right than another to declare their sentiments on that point. It's a direct quote from Madison. Madison went on to point out that it was not clear at all whether this question should come before the judges. Indeed, one might wonder here what judicial remedy would lie for a Secretary of the Treasury removed by the President. The debate in the House was followed by one in the Senate once the bill had arrived there in July. Now, the Senate adopted, I mentioned this, that the Senate adopted a rule that privileged their debates by making them secret. So we don't know how the debate went. But we do know from the diary of Senator Maclay of New York that some senators felt the House was attempting to undercut the privileges of the Senate and to elevate the presidency beyond what the Constitution made it. So when the Senate voted on the bill of July 16th, there were a number of senators who wanted to keep the removal power jointly in the Senate and the President. The vote on July 16th resulted in a tie. As per constitutional rules, the Vice President voted and broke the tie. John Adams voted to approve the law. In other words, it sustained the House position. Now let's recap this episode and talk about constitutional construction or interpretation. The question addressed was how the heads of executive departments would be appointed. The first construction concerned the creation of secretaries of executive departments. The Constitution does not have a specific clause on the heads of departments, but it alludes to such departments in Article 2, Section 2. The same article also specifies that the President, by and with the advice of the Senate, shall appoint other officers of the United States, which all parties reasonably construed to extend to the secretaries of executive departments. The second construction involved where the removal power lay. The Constitution was silent on this question. However, Article 2, Section 4 did provide a means of removing Article 2, Section 4 did provide a means of removing officers for high crimes and misdemeanors by the process of impeachment and conviction. One possible reading of the Constitution was that this inferred that all officers essentially had a tenure of good behavior. But this was not a credible position. The real question was whether the removal power was inherent in the executive, or was jointly shared between the executive and the Senate, or if it was solely a prerogative of Congress. Virtually all parties were anxious to avoid the third option, that Congress could vest the removal power of its own mere motion. They were construing the Constitution, after all. The Senate was eager to preserve its prerogative and to keep the removal power for itself. In this case, they wanted the interpretation that removal was linked by implication to the appointment power. The House's version interpreted the removal power as inherent in the executive and thus vested exclusively in the president. Both these interpretations agreed on the same basic rules of constitutional construction. First, it took a close reading of the text, and it made a closely reasoned analysis of the text. Second, it paid close attention to language. It interpreted the document as internally consistent and to affect the most reasonable ends. And finally, it was in line with general principles. These are the basic rules that we can divine from the debate. The resolution to this, by the way, is a struggle between the two branches. The House sent up its bill, which the Senate split on and lost thanks to the Vice President casting the tie-breaking vote. But the Senate, by the way, was not done. When the House sent over a bill to organize the Treasury, the Senate returned the bill with the provision added that the Secretary of the Treasury could only be removed with the advice and consent of the Senate. James Madison recommended to the House that it refuse the change, which it did, and they sent it back to the Senate with that part excised. The Senate voted on the bill again, but this time it resulted in a tie, a vote which once again the Vice President broke in favor of vesting the removal power in the executive. So this is a fairly dramatic moment here over what I think probably most people would not think is a very dramatic thing. But keep in mind here, you've got several different things going on. First of all, there is a political question. Are you going to empower the president to be able to hold his officers responsible? Will he be able to fire his secretaries and go and get new ones? Or will you subordinate that to the advice and consent of the Senate? And this moment of interpretation demonstrates that two very important things. First, that Congress had the right to interpret the document. Second, and that, by the way, rejects the position that all constitutional questions are necessary judicial questions. And Madison's very clear about this. Constitutional interpretation will take place in many different locales. That Congress will do it, that the president will do it, and that the judiciary will do it. Secondly, though, the struggle between the House and the Senate results in a House victory, and I think that's important as well. The presidency might have been more drastically weakened here had not that removal power been essentially construed to lie or to be vested in the executive power rather than jointly held. Now, the first Congress also established the first of the federal taxes in the form of a tariff and tonnage. Customs duties were still the preferred means of tax revenue and remained so early on. There we go. Okay. The second session of Congress included some heavily weighted items. And this is where we start to see a lot of breakdown and partisan bickering occurring. In 1790, the House under James Madison's leadership rejected Alexander Hamilton's plan for the assumption of state debts. Briefly, part of Hamilton's plan was for the federal government to assume all state debts and amortize them on a federal schedule. States like South Carolina and Massachusetts, who still had heavy debts and had just parted with their best source of revenue, such as customs duties, desperately wanted the assumption. States like Virginia, which had largely disposed of their debt and were in no hurry to see the federal government develop such close ties with creditors, were very suspicious of the plan. And so on April 12, 1790, Assumption was voted down 31 to 29. It's a close vote, but it indicated how powerful James Madison and his allies could be. Don't forget, of course, the most populous state, Virginia, does not want the Assumption. Now, Assumption would eventually be passed, but only after James Madison's support was secured by the unlikely alliance of Jefferson and Hamilton in persuading him to acquiesce to the program as a national necessity to secure America's credit. But this point, which had little to do with constitutional debate, is important because it coincided with another, more constitutional debate in Congress. On March 16th, a House committee reported to the general body on two anti-slavery petitions. One of them was from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Here's just we have a number of sermons which are written against slave trade, and this is actually picking up 1760s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But one of these anti-slavery petitions was signed by none other than Benjamin Franklin, who, of course, quite famously was a framer of the Constitution and really sort of America's, grand old father at this point. Both petitions asked Congress to do what it could, quote, to promote mercy and justice towards this distressed race. The committee reported back the following conclusions. 1. Congress had no power to prohibit the slave trade before 1808. 2. Congress could not emancipate any slaves born within or imported into the country prior to that year. 3. Congress could not interfere with the state's police regulation of slavery. Police regulation just means internal regulation, all aspects of something. So in this case, the relation of master and slave, basically. 4. Congress could regulate the slave trade and levy the $10 importation tax at any time. And 5, by implication, this is particularly when you consider point number 1, by implication, Congress might have the power to emancipate slaves after 1808. This report was too much for Southerners to swallow. One Southern representative entered into a harangue so violent that he was called to order by another member. And William L. Smith, the Lincoln's Inn educated representative of South Carolina, claimed that the Constitution's language prohibited any discussion of the slave trade until 1808. An incredulous James Madison pointed to the obvious language in Article 1, Section 9, asking how a tax and duty, it specifies that a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 per person. And he asked, how is this supposed to be imposed if we're prohibited from even discussing the slave trade? But the point really is not that Smith had a credible constitutional position. He didn't. The point is that he was able, as were his Southern brethren, to shut down any debate on the slave trade. This was an important constitutional moment. Assumption was a delicate issue. It raised questions of federal power, albeit not in a constitutional context. Nonetheless, it became quickly apparent that for the federal government to succeed, assumption of the debt would be necessary. The petitions against slavery raised the question of the limits of federal power in a deliberately constitutional context. The committee's report on the petition suggested that Congress might be able to use its powers to bear on the institution of slavery in a number of ways, particularly after 1808, when the congressional prohibition on action against the slave trade was lifted. The indecent response of Southerners, and that's Madison's characterization, by the way. He calls it indecent. I think at one point he even calls it obscene. Suggested that Southern representatives could unite to defend their institution against even reasonable constructions of the Constitution. So once again, constitutional language is going to be a function of political power, and we can never forget that. Congress would, however, engage in interpretation of the slavery clause in the Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Clause. It did so because of a request from Pennsylvania's governor arising from an incident which occurred in 1788. It involved a man named John Davis, who was the slave of a Virginia planter who lived along Virginia's western border with Pennsylvania. When Pennsylvania and Virginia adjusted its border, John Davis and his master were suddenly living in Pennsylvania. But because the Virginian never registered as slave, John Davis was technically free. And if you don't understand this, just remember that Pennsylvania has passed a gradual abolition statute in 1780. So you are required to register slaves by that law. If you don't do it, they're free. And so there were actually a number of extensions which were given to John Davis's owner and anybody else in that region, and his owner just didn't follow up. So he lost his property right in his slave. And abolitionists actually told Davis so, and he left with them. 3 Virginians left Virginia, went to Pennsylvania, seized John Davis, and returned him to Virginia. The state of Pennsylvania charged the men with kidnapping, but Virginia refused to extradite them. Frustrated, the Pennsylvania governor submitted the matter to President Washington, who accordingly laid the matter before Congress. The matter was referred to a special committee, and after a few false starts, the committee produced a bill, which became an act respecting fugitives from justice and persons escaping from the service of their masters. The larger part of the bill dealt with the extradition of suspected criminals. In those cases, the state executive was authorized to make a request of the executive of another state to deliver up a fugitive. This would obligate the state executive to find the fugitive, if possible, and to hold him for a period of time before the other state retrieved him. In short, the rendition of fugitive criminals was a public duty, and Congress outlined the duties of public officers in the states in order to fulfill this Article 4, Section 2 command. Regarding fugitive slaves, slaveholders were authorized by the Act to seize their fugitives wherever they found them. The law further empowered state or federal judges or magistrates to issue certificates of removal to remove the slave across state lines. The last section gave slaveholders a civil action against any who deprived them of their property. The civil action was worth $500. This was the Fugitive Slave Act. It was Congress's first interpretation of Article 4, Section 2, and it would be the only one until it was amended in 1850. Despite the fact that the original law had more to do with fugitives from justice than fugitives from labor, it became known as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And here's actually a fugitive slave notice from Thomas Jefferson. And these littered the newspapers of the 1760s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the way through the antebellum era. There were other important debates that occurred in Congress in the 1790s, but we will skip ahead to the 5th Congress, which met from 1797 to 1799. It was a hotly partisan time. The constitutional debates, which had begun with Hamilton and Jefferson debating whether a national bank was comprehended under the Necessary and Proper Clause, was but one of many disputes between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison. Most of the differences were associated with policy, which is to say that the Democratic-Republican resentment over the Jay Treaty of 1796, which restored normal diplomatic relations with Great Britain, and the whiskey excise, part of Hamilton's early plan to earn a national revenue and restore the nation's credit, were about the use of constitutional power, not whether such power was properly federal in nature. Everybody knew that treaties were the purview of the executive branch and the Senate, and that the national government was empowered to do so. And the whiskey excise may have been onerous to people in western counties, but it had been passed by Congress and it was an admitted constitutional power. And really what we see here are a real breakdown between two groups of people who believe in something fundamentally different. Those who had rallied really behind Alexander Hamilton, but also behind George Washington and John Adams, began to call themselves Federalists in a way that meant more than simply we support the national government. Federalists they believed in creditor-friendly policies. They were not scared of debt. They were actually quite happy having a large national debt. It allowed them to have higher taxes, to appropriate revenues in such a way that they could promote manufactures, direct commercial policy, and they're also tremendously pro-British. The Democratic Republicans wanted to ease the debt burden, to free up trade, to loosen the bonds of government. And instead of being pro-British, the Democratic Republicans were very much pro-French. Federalists believed strongly in rule by a merit-oriented natural aristocracy. The Democratic Republicans were definitely more people-oriented. In fact, the Democratic Republicans come about not as an organized party in any way, but because people start coming together in these political clubs. They style themselves the Democratic Club of Philadelphia, the Republican Club of New Haven, so on and so forth. And many of these Democratic and Republican clubs openly attack Federalist policy. And the open attack on Federalist policy, excuse me, the open attack on Federalist policy greatly angers George Washington. And when the Whiskey Rebellion happens, this is Washington rallying the militia and getting them ready to go out and march against the Whiskey Rebels in western Pennsylvania. And by the way, it extended to Kentucky and Virginia as well. Washington, in his next address to Congress following the Whiskey Rebellion, complains that these certain self-created societies are actually what has caused the Whiskey Rebellion. And so there's a real democratic voice of the people sense to the Democratic Republicans and a real elitist disdain of them by the Federalists. And that's a very real thing in 1795 and 1796. The 1796 election, therefore, turns out to be America's first truly partisan election. And the Democratic Republicans, while they fiercely contested it and they campaigned for their man, Thomas Jefferson, they lose. John Adams becomes president. Thomas Jefferson would poll the second highest number of votes and thus become vice president. This turned out to be untenable, of course, because he ends up leading the opposition literally from the office of the vice president, which proves the founders' electoral system is something of a farce. For Adams, who ran a very pro-British foreign policy, the opposition from within the executive office was incredibly difficult to tolerate. Jefferson refused to acknowledge the executive's policy, and for the most part, so did Congress. Adams was more and more powerless. Then, tensions between America and France came to a head in the March of 1798, when news arrived of the XYZ affair, President Adams's secret diplomatic delegation to France, which included, by the way, the future Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall, was effectively rebuffed by French representatives, later identified simply as Messieurs X, Y, and Z. Amongst their insulting demands included a 50,000-pound bribe to the French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand and a large loan to the French government. When this was refused, they were told that the French would then attack their ports and attack their ships. In response, Adams requested that Congress authorize military measures in preparation for war. Congress responded by increasing the size of the Navy and authorizing construction of additional coastal fortification. This humiliation, once publicly disclosed in America, turned public opinion against the French. Ultra-Federalists in Adams's cabinet demanded a declaration of war. Adams did not ask Congress for one, but he did take steps against the French. While Adams resisted the demand for war, in early July of 1798, Congress annulled the 1778 Treaty of Alliance, authorizing military action, authorizing military action against French warships. They quadrupled the size of the army to 13,000 people. They initiated efforts to create a provisional army of 50,000 troops. Perhaps more importantly, Jefferson's supporters in Congress melted away, and the Federalists were ascendant. In addition to these military measures, in reaction to fears of the Democratic Republican sympathies to France and possible disloyalty to the United States, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed, and John Adams signed, a series of bills during the summer of 1798 that would be thereafter referred to as the Alien and Sedition Acts. In addition to empowering Adams to detain and deport aliens deemed disloyal to the United States and tramping down seditious and disloyal speech, the acts clearly had a political component aimed at neutralizing the political power of Jefferson and his fellow Democratic Republicans. The first bill, the Naturalization Act, increased the residency requirement for aliens to become citizens and their eligibility to vote from 5 to 14 years. Since the Democratic Republicans enjoyed so much support among recent immigrants from France and other European countries, this was seen as a direct assault on the Jefferson, Madison supported Democratic Republicans. The second was the Act Concerning Aliens, commonly known as the Aliens Friends Act, which authorized the president to deport any resident alien considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, regardless of what his home country was. The third, the Alien Enemies Act, and still, by the way, largely in effect today, authorized the president to apprehend and deport resident aliens if their home countries were at war with the United States. The final bill, the Sedition Act, made it a crime to oppose any measure or measures of the United States, publish false, scandalous, or malicious writing, or speak, write, or print any statement critical of the government or its officials, which brought the government or its officials into contempt or disrepute. Reaction by the Democratic Republicans was immediate and hostile, interpreting the laws as a purposeful, direct assault on their most fundamental right to criticize the government. Protest meetings, at which resolutions were passed declaring the Alien and Sedition Acts as unconstitutional, were held throughout Kentucky and spread to the more populated and politically powerful states of New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Typical of such resolutions were those passed by thousands of local citizens who had flooded into Lexington, Kentucky on July 4th and declared the Alien and Sedition Acts as void and recent Federalist measures unconstitutional, impolitic, unjust, and a disgrace to the American name. Ultimately, the protest efforts during the summer and fall of 1798 culminated in the adoption of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, anonymously drafted by Madison and Jefferson, respectively. Read the Alien and Sedition Acts in concert with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and think about two things. First of all, what the constitutional issue actually is, that is, the substantive disagreement. And second, the manner in which these resolutions were to be resolved. There are, by the way, a number of different reactions to this. What you have here is a genuine controversy over what the limits of federal power are, and the question then becomes, how do you resolve this? One way, of course, was to fight about it in Congress, literally. This is Matthew Lyons, who first spit on a Federalist representative who was insulting him, and then when he was attacked by the Federalist who had a cane, came after him with a set of fire tongs. So that was definitely one way to try to resolve it. But Lyons himself, by the way, would become a very famous defendant. He would be charged under the Sedition Act, and he actually would be found guilty of it, sentenced to jail and fined. Congress would lift that fine or rescind it in 1840. It was never enforced, by the way. But in any case, or I should say it was never collected. The judgment was never collected. But anyway, we want to think here about constitutional disputes and their resolution. You have seen it in several cases already. Over the removal power, it was Congress that resolved that constitutional question. When we get to the bank, it ends up being the president. I didn't talk about that, but you'll read it. It ends up going to the president. The president solicits the advice of of Jefferson and Hamilton. These are the major departments of finance and state. And then he makes his choice about the constitutionality of the national bank. But the Alien and Sedition Acts now directly involve the people, the states, and the federal government. And we want to talk about how this crisis is ultimately resolved.